Well, good evening. I want to welcome all of you to the Holland Land Office Museum and to our HLOM Speakers Bureau for 2018. Tonight we're honored to have with us the author of the newly published book, Emory Upton, The Misunderstood Reformer, David Fitzpatrick. And he's going to talk, of course, on his book and a little bit about Upton as well. I just want to give you a brief background on David because it's pretty impressive what he's done in his career and probably what he'll be doing in the future with history. I was first introduced to David back in about 2007 on the telephone. It was about his dissertation that he had presented in 1996, and I discovered this online and I decided to look at it, and then I pursued him to get more information about Emory Upton. I have to say it's been a great resource for me in my research work. And Dave received his BS degree from the United States Military Academy at West Point, and he served 14 years as an active artillery officer in the United States Army. He received his MA and his PhD from the University of Michigan, and has authored several military journals, including the award that you received too on one of those for your work. In 2002, Dave from the Society of the Military History was awarded the Mankato Prize as one of the best articles in the Military History Journal. His newest work, of course, will be discussed tonight, and I think you'll be most impressed by what he has to say about Upton's post-Civil War career. Now, Dave currently is the faculty president and professor of history at Washtenaw. Is that correct?
Washtenaw.
Washtenaw Community College in Ann Arbor, Michigan. In addition, he has taught at the U.S. Military Academy, the Oakland University, and the University of Michigan. And in 1991, the West Point honored him as the outstanding instructor in the history department, which is quite credible, I would say. Yeah. David's book addresses Upton's honored military career and focuses on his writings and reforms which were misunderstood by several noted military men as well as historians. And David will present his defense of Mr. Upton on some of those points if you haven't already read them in the book. In the book also, and this is the one thing that really has impressed me after having read Ambrose and Mikey's book and several other papers on Upton, that Dave really focuses on the character, the personality of Upton, and touches on it, which is most essential, I think, to any person who is in history or otherwise. You really want to know what makes them tick, and Dave's touched upon that. It's most important. And in Upton, and as far as Dave's words on Upton, this kind of summed it up. This will be a good segue into your program. He, Upton, had proposed a system he hoped would defend the American Democratic Republic in time of war and protect its institutions from potential seizures. And I think that kind of sums up what your book is relative to in the latter part of it.
It is.
Well, thank you for coming.
Thank you, Don, and thank you for having me. Thank you. You'll forgive me if I refer to my notes once in a while. First of all, to keep myself on track because I have a tendency to wander. And second of all, because I've got some quotes that I think are interesting that I would rather read them word for word and rather than from memory. I got to tell you that the most common question I'm asked about this is, why did you do Upton? What got you on Upton? I've been asked it at least 4 times tonight. And I think Lucy asked me that on the radio program. So let me real quickly explain to you why I chose Upton, how I got on this topic. The answer is money. It was money. When I, as Don said, I got my master's from the University of Michigan and then went to teach at West Point, then went back out to the active duty Army and decided to then leave active duty, go back to Michigan and finish my PhD. And I was in Germany at the time, and while I was in Germany, my dissertation advisor called me up and he said, "Dave, have you figured out what you want to do for your dissertation?" And I said, "Not really, John." He goes, He says, well, I know you really want to do something on naval history, which indeed I did. I'm fascinated by naval history. But there's $5,000 here at the Clements Library at the University of Michigan set aside for researching Emory Upton. And that's a lot of money for research. That'll fund a lot of research trips. And he said, don't sell your soul. I remember saying that really well. Don't sell your soul for $5,000. You don't want to pick a topic you're not interested in. But if you think you're interested in it, you ought to think about it. So I dove deep into Upton and found indeed there was much to be written, and so I jumped at the $5,000. The next year then I spent at the U of M doing as much research as I possibly could on site at the U of M, looking at published sources, looking at microfilms, looking at newspapers, doing all the background research I could before I went on my first research trip to spend some of that $5,000. And that first research trip then was going to take me first here to Batavia, and then to West Point to look at their archives, and then finally down to Wilmington, Delaware, to the Hagley Library, the Winterthur collections. It's where the DuPont papers are. Henry DuPont was one of Upton's West Point classmates, and they were good friends, and there was a substantial collection of his letters down there. So this was going to be my first stop. Well, before you do a research trip, especially to a small place like this, a big place like the Library of Congress, you just show up. But a small county records office like there was in this room at the time, you give them a call. You make sure they're going to be open. Make sure that that they expect you. So I called, and I got a hold of the county historian at the time, Susan Conklin, and told her that I was going to be coming through, and I was going to be researching Upton, and gave her the dates. Your office is going to be open. And she said, yeah, the office is going to be open, but she said, you're researching Upton. And I said, yeah. She goes, have you ever seen his handwriting? And I said, no. And she says, you probably ought to have a different topic. True story. True story. Well, what I want to do tonight is focus on his post-Civil War career, because that's what's misunderstood about Upton. What I want to do, though, before I do that is just in case you don't know his life story, give you a really quick run through on his life story and painting some very broad brush and skipping a lot. He's of course born here in Batavia, 1839. He entered West Point in 1856. He was the last of the 5-year classes. There was a spate of classes there that were supposed to be 5-year classes. The Civil War ended that. While he was at West Point, shortly after arriving, this 17-year-old kid wrote a letter to one of his sisters. And I don't know, he's clearly responding to her letter. I don't know what she wrote. I can guess. I think in the letter she must have asked, why the hell have you gone to West Point? This was his reply. I would not leave the academy for the $5,000 that Brother Jim spoke about. If I should graduate, $1 million would not place me in the position I would then occupy had I not received the appointment. My reasons are hidden, but set it down, and he underlines it, set it down. If I should graduate and there should be a civil war, the North might be somewhat benefited by me. He wrote that in the summer of 1856. This kid's on a crusade. He's on a crusade to end slavery. Well, his Civil War career it's stunning. Graduated in May of 1861. They sped the 1861 class up by about a month to get them out, and then the 1862 class, they graduated the next month. So the June of 61 class is the one with George Custer. Upton graduated a month before. He was at First Bull Run, where he served as a general's aide. He was in the artillery on the Peninsular Campaign and at Antietam. Shortly after the Battle of Antietam, he finagled himself command of the 121st New York. He commanded the 121st New York at Fredericksburg, and most importantly at Chancellorsville, and kind of on a side campaign of Chancellorsville, he was at Salem Church, where the 121st was just simply decimated, although fought very well. Shortly after Salem Church, on his way to Gettysburg, he was promoted to brigade command. I will tell you that that summer, it appears that he bounced back and forth between regimental and brigade command any number of times. And so it's not clear when he, at least to me, and I don't think Sal Solella ever figured it out either, it's not clear to me when he became permanent commander of his brigade, but by November of 1863, he was the brigade commander. He led that brigade at Rappahannock Station, and that's the first inkling in the leadership of the Army of the Potomac that this is a special guy, that this brigade took reinforced Confederate redoubts on the near bank of the Rappahannock River, and did so with few casualties, captured a couple thousand soldiers. The following year, in the so-called Overland Campaign, is where he made his mark, first at the Wilderness, but then most famously, and this is the thing that if you read a Civil War book, this is where you encounter Upton, is of course at the Battle of Spotsylvania. He led his reinforced brigade against Confederate entrenchments on May 10th, 1864, and the assault succeeded beyond anybody's wildest dreams, got into the Confederate position having taken few casualties, and it's really kind of a remarkable feat, and you almost got to get on the ground to appreciate what he accomplished here. He really reconned the position well and figured out how to get close to the Confederates before they could see him. Anyway, he got into the position. Unfortunately, the follow-up attacks didn't happen the way they were supposed to. His brigade got forced out, and it was in forcing him out that his brigade suffered serious casualties. But after Spotsylvania, he's engaged at Cold Harbor. Then, when Jubal Early invaded the North, the 6th Corps got sent from the Army of the Potomac down in the Petersburg area. It got sent up to defend Washington, D.C., and eventually into the Shenandoah Valley. So he went with the 6th Corps, fought in the valley, fought at 3rd Winchester, badly wounded at 3rd Winchester, took a 12-pound solid iron cannonball right in the butt here. Apparently didn't break anything. He went home for a few weeks to recuperate, and then got sent out west, the west, of course, being the theater between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. Got sent west, where he took command of a cavalry division in James Wilson's Cavalry Corps, and he participated in Wilson's raid through Alabama and Georgia in March and April of 1865. And if Wilson's raid is something you're not familiar with, just think Sherman's march on horseback, because that's what it was. Ripping up every railroad they encountered, destroying every iron and niter mill they ran into, destroying cotton gins, destroying anything of any worth to the south, especially in Selma, and especially, now this map shows you Birmingham. It wasn't called Birmingham at the time. The name Birmingham comes after the war. But Birmingham and Selma especially, tremendous amount of destruction. And Columbus, Georgia, by the way, too. After the war, he got assigned to various posts in the Reconstruction South. Part of the Reconstruction Army. He was in Memphis, he was in Louisville, he was in Atlanta. He also undertook the revision of the U.S. Army's infantry tactics. Thought that the infantry had fought poorly in the Civil War. We're going to revise the tactics. His tactics went before 2 different boards, and they got adopted. He also met and married Emily Martin of Auburn, New York. It was a short-lived marriage. Emily was ill. I've never been able to discover for certain what it was. I'm guessing tuberculosis. There's never any mention of tuberculosis or of consumption, but it sure sounds like she had tuberculosis. But they got married in February of 1868. She died in March of 1870, so barely 2 years married. In 1870, He got assigned to West Point to be the commandant of cadets. The commandant is the person who's in charge of the Corps of Cadets. The dean runs instruction, the superintendent runs the whole place, and the commandant is in charge of the Corps of Cadets. He was there for 5 years. He had an interesting time at West Point. Among other things, he had to deal with the first two black cadets at West Point. The first of which, a gentleman by the name of Smith, eventually dropped out without graduating. Henry Flipper stuck around and graduated. Upton had much to do, especially with Flipper's success. He also then, while at West Point, undertook another revision of his tactics. This time he and some friends sat down and they revised the infantry, the artillery, and the cavalry tactics for the United States Army. Those tactics remained the staple, the primary tactics for the Army until the 1890s. In 1875, his assignment at West Point was up, so the commanding general of the Army, William Tecumseh Sherman, sent him and two other officers on an around-the-world trip. They were to inspect armies of various nations around the world to see what they might learn from those armies. They started on the West Coast, sailed across the Pacific, Japan, China, India. They spent 2 months in India, and more on that later. In India, they were planning to then cross over into Russia via Afghanistan, which was apparently a bad idea even back then. The British recommended they not do that. And so they instead got on a steamer and they went through the Indian Ocean to what was then Persia, today is Iran, climbed on horses, rode through Iran into Russia, and then to Turkey, to Constantinople, from there to Italy, from Italy back to Russia, to Germany, to Austria, down into the Balkans to see, for briefly, they observed the ongoing Serbo-Turkish War, back to Germany, France, Britain, home. They did that in about 18 months. When they returned, Upton was assigned to Fortress Monroe, Virginia, which is right down there at the tip of the peninsula down by Norfolk Naval Base, where he was the superintendent of instruction for the artillery school. The artillery school was there. But while doing that, he set out to work on two projects. The first was to write a report of his trip. And what he wanted to do was to end that report with his take on American military history. And that project got so big, he ended up chopping it off, and he published the report of his trip called Armies of Asia and Europe. And let me tell you, don't read it if you're sleepy, because it will put you out. It'll put you out. And then he continued working on his project that he called the Military Policy of the United States. While working on that, he put forward ideas about the reform of the United States Army. More on that later. That reform got killed. That's the bad news. The good news, he got promoted to colonel in the 4th Artillery, took command of the 4th Artillery Regiment out in the Presidio, San Francisco in early 1881, and then 3 months later, put a gun to his head and committed suicide. In his lifetime, not terribly influential in the Army. His reforms, his ideas had been rejected. But after the Spanish-American War, which was a debacle for the United States Army, I tell my students in my military history classes, we won only because we were fighting Spain. Had we been fighting any other European power, we'd have been in trouble. It was an absolute debacle. The Secretary of War got fired. The new Secretary of War, Elihu Root, was appointed with the mission of fixing the Army. And a couple of Army officers said, have you read Armies of Asia and Europe? Have you heard of Emory Upton? Have you read Military Policy of the United States, which at that point was unpublished? There were manuscripts floating around. And he said no, and they gave them to him. And Upton's ideas became a critical part, not all of it, but a critical part of the so-called root reforms of the early 1900s. So this is why he's an important guy. Well, he is also, as I want to suggest here, he's misunderstood. And I want to give you a couple of examples of this misunderstanding. Now, there's a lot of people have written about him, but the two most important people are, first of all, Russell Weigley, who in 1962 published this book, Towards an American Army. This is a book that it's a history of the ideas that floated through and informed the American Army's development, what officers were thinking about and what they were saying. So it's not a biography of Upton, but there is a chapter in this book on Upton, and Upton's an important part of the rest of the book. Now, in Weigley's defense, he's not writing a biography of Upton. And so he's not getting into the sources of Upton the way I did. He's looking at what's readily available. And his conclusion here, and I want to read it to you, is that Upton, and I quote here, ended in deep pessimism because he did so in part because he failed to acknowledge that military policy must reflect the general policy of the nation, and that more than that, reflect the general spirit of the nation. Because Upton never really attempted to understand the civilian view of military policy, he failed utterly to formulate a policy in harmony with American national genius. Weigley goes on to call Upton a militaristic zealot, and he says that Upton is responsible for what he calls Uptonian pessimism that ran through the Army in the late 19th century, and charges that Upton was essentially a wannabe Prussian militarist. He wanted to turn the United States into something, at least the United States Army, and therefore the United States, into something that looked like the Prussian-German model. Well, he published this in 1962. A year later, Stephen Ambrose defended his dissertation in 1963. His dissertation was Upton on the Army, and it's for sale out there in the bookstore. This was Ambrose's dissertation, word for word. This book was, but the dissertation came out in 1963. Ambrose ratified Weigley's conclusions, agreed with him entirely. He's a wannabe Prussian militarist. It's a badly flawed biography, and I may get into that, or if you have questions, I'd be glad to. The thing here is that when I started my research, when I started on this project, these two gentlemen were giants. They're both now dead. Ambrose's reputation is somewhat in the dumpster because of other things we found out about him. Weigley, who passed away here 5 or 6 years ago, remains a giant. I mean, he's a giant in the field. His works, The American Way of War, Eisenhower's Lieutenants, they're magnificent works. And so when I started my project, and again, Ambrose's downfall was yet to come, my start point was they were right. Because how could they be wrong? It's Stephen Ambrose and Russell Weigley. How could they be wrong? They've got to be right. And what I then sought to do was to write a fuller biography, because that's a thin biography. And it's not only thin this way, it's just thin. And the question I had, and good research projects start with questions, and sometimes you have a hypothesis you're testing, and I didn't have one. I just had a question. Question was, how did this devout Methodist farm boy, abolitionist from a small town in upstate New York, how did he become a Prussian militarist? What was the process by which that happened? That's what I was going to explain, because I assumed these guys were right. Well, it turns out they weren't. At least I don't think they were. And so what I want to lay out for you here, and what remains tonight, is some elements of... Uh-oh, that's me.
Your cell phone dropped that. Just don't say gotta go.
One thing's for certain, it's not the wife. Okay. So what I want to do is lay out at least a little bit of what's in the book, and not that I'm not willing to lay it all out, but we'd be here till 2 in the morning, and then you wouldn't buy any books. So I want to lay out at least what I think are some of the more interesting parts of it. Important in this idea that he's a wannabe Prussian was that on that around-the-world trip, he was most impressed by, predictably, Germany. That it was the German experience. Well, let me be very clear here. He was. He was, and for those of you who have read the book or who will read the book, you will find out not only was he impressed by it, but he got into a, what's a polite word I could use here? He got into a contest with the American legation in Berlin, the charge d'affaires, and with the ambassador in Berlin over his lack of an invitation to the Prussian maneuvers, or the German maneuvers in the fall of 1876. He very badly wanted to go to these things. And so, yeah, he was very impressed with the Germans. He was more impressed by the Indian Army. He spent 2 months there. There was a reason he spent 2 months there. And to be clear here, the Indian Army is primarily an army led by regular British officers, manned by Indians. And there was a lot in that army that he saw that impressed him. And what I concluded, the parallel he drew was between the British officers leading Indians, and they're Indians. He doesn't have much good to say about India or Indians. British officers leading Indians, they do a really good job. Those are good units. The parallel is to American West Point trained officers leading volunteers. That was the key. And that's nothing like what's going on in Prussia. He was also, in his trip to China, found a lot of important lessons in the Chinese system or lack thereof. He also briefly observed, as I mentioned, the Serbo-Turkish War in the summer of 1876. I don't know. I wish he were alive, because I'd love to ask him why that doesn't show up in the book. It's not there. It's just not there. It's important, because he comes away with some interesting conclusions there that play out down the road. Well, the proof of his anti-militarism, though, allegedly, comes in these 2 books. Army's Invasion in Europe, which he paid to have Appleton publish. No one wanted to publish this, and they didn't make any money on it. And then Military Policy of the United States. This gets published by the War Department in 1903, long after his death. More on that in a few minutes. These books do 2 things. First of all, between the 2 of them, they put forward a series of reforms. These are the changes we need to make to the United States Army. And then Military Policy of the United States, beyond that, is a military history of the United States. First one anybody wrote. Hadn't been done before. And it's unfinished at the time of his suicide. At the time of his suicide, he's up to 1862 in the Civil War. It's unfinished. The book, it's a dense read, I will tell you this. It's fascinating. It's a screed. It is a screed. He blames Congress for everything that ever went wrong in American military history. Everything. And even when it's demonstrable that a general might have done something wrong. He might admit that, but then he'll trace that back to Congress. So everything that's wrong with American military policy comes from Congress, and he lays it out in this book. It's a screed. It's unfair, but it's interesting. Well, the reforms, what are they? He wants to end lineal promotion. Now, just in case you don't know what that means. Lineal promotion meant that when you were commissioned as a lieutenant, you were assigned to a regiment. And you're a lieutenant in the regiment. And the only way you become a captain is if one of the captains in that regiment dies, gets promoted, or resigns. Then you become a captain. The only way you become a major is if one of the majors dies, gets promoted, or resigns. Then you become a major. There's no transferring between regiments. There's a spot in the 3rd Artillery. Now you're in the 4th Artillery. And so what you end up with is lieutenants who are 40 years old, captains who are 50 years old, majors and lieutenant colonels who are 60 and 70 years old, which, needless to say, probably is not a really good idea. So he wants to end lineal promotion. And hand in hand with this, he wants mandatory retirement. There's a retirement age. You're going to hit, you're going to retire, gone. He wanted a reform of the staff. He thought the American staff system was badly broken. He wanted the adoption of something he called the National Volunteers. Without getting into great detail about what that was, something that looks a lot like our National Guard of today. He wanted the creation of a war college and a staff college. He wanted to strengthen the position of the commanding general of the United States Army. The commanding general position had existed since after the War of 1812. With one exception in its history, the commanding general had been weak and impotent. The one exception was when Ulysses S. Grant became the commanding general in 1864. Otherwise, the position of commanding general of the United States Army had been a horrific job. William Tecumseh Sherman got driven out of Washington, D.C., said, "The hell with it, I got so little power, I might as well move to St. Louis." And he did. No point in being in D.C. I hate D.C., I'll move to St. Louis. So he wanted to increase the power of the commanding general, decrease the power of the Secretary of War. All of these, except for the National Volunteers, were part of a bill Congress took up in 1878 called the Burnside Bill. And yes, that Burnside. Ambrose Burnside, by this time, was a senator in the United States Senate. The Burnside Bill reflected Upton's ideas, except for the National Volunteers. That bill got defeated in the Senate, never even made it to the House. The charge of militarism comes out of all of that. And it comes from things Upton wrote. So, for one example, Upton wrote to his good friend James Wilson, "Sherman is accused of desiring to dwarf the Secretary," meaning the Secretary of War, "till he can, without inconvenience, carry him in his vest pocket. Confidentially, there is just where I would like to see him." So, want the commanding general of the Army to be telling the civilian Secretary of War what to do. That does look militaristic. That does look like you're trying to supersede civilian control of the military with military control. Here's the problem. Problem number one is there's a context to that. The context to that statement is the post-war Reconstruction Army. After the Civil War, Andrew Johnson, President of the United States, and let me back up a second. To be clear, let me be clear here. Upton was an abolitionist. He thought the South needed to be punished for what it had done in the Civil War. He is not a let's forgive and forget and let's all be brothers. Well, after the Civil War, Andrew Johnson, of course, wanted to have what you would call a mild Reconstruction. Congress passed a series of Reconstruction Acts which took Reconstruction out of his hands, put the Army in charge of Reconstruction, put the Secretary of War in charge of Reconstruction, cut the president completely out of it. Upton saw that as a threat to the Republic, that an appointed official with the power of the purse would then have the power of the sword, as he put it, could command the army against the will of the commander-in-chief, and could threaten the Republic. And there were events in 1866, 67, 68 which seemed to suggest that the Republic could be threatened by these events. That's the context for his desiring to shrink the power of the Secretary of War. He's not trying to diminish civilian control, because what he's trying to do is get the president more directly involved. He sees the Secretary of War as being an interloper in the relationship between the Army and the constitutional commander-in-chief. Another element that is argues, it's kind of interesting here, I think, about his alleged militarism, is a chapter in the military policy of the United States that's not there. So let me tell you a little bit about this. So we go back to Elihu Root, becomes Secretary of War. This has been published. It's already in book form. Army officers give him the book. They go rooting around. There's a manuscript of military policy in the United States floating around, couple copies of it. They find one, they give it to Root. Root's really impressed by it. We got to publish this thing. So he turns the project over to a handful of Army officers. You guys get this thing ready for publication. Do all the editorial work you need to do. Let's get this thing published. They start going through the manuscript, and they come across 3 chapters that they really don't know what to do with. 2 of the chapters have to do with Confederate war finance. Fine. And by the way, these chapters still exist. The other chapter, the 3rd, that's the cover of it, Civil and Military Policy of Rome, chapter 33. Now, just so you know, chapter 33 in the original manuscript falls right in the middle of the 1862 campaigns. And the officers who are editing this thing, they said, what the hell is this doing here? Let's get it out. So they took out those 2 chapters on Confederate war finance, and they took this chapter out, and they published Military Policy of the United States. So, fast forward to, I think, 1993, a long time ago. I'm doing my research, and I'm down at Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania, going through the archives there. And I come across this. And I knew its existence. I knew it was there. I was not surprised to find it at all. Knew it was there. And I started leafing through it. This is really odd. I mean, no wonder they pulled this out. Of course they did. And I took a few notes on it, put it away, and looked at something else. Went home. About a year later, I'm starting to write the chapter on the politics of reform. It gets deeply into the politics of the 1870s. And as I'm writing that chapter and pulling the material in, the light went on. What's going on here? I called up the guy at Carlisle Barracks and I said, make me a copy of that and send it to me. And he was, it's going to cost you $75. Make me a copy and send it to me. And he did. It just leapt off the page. So please forgive me. Let me read you a couple of extended quotations from the chapter on the civil and military policy of Rome. Upton argued in this chapter that Rome's numerous dictatorships, I'm quoting now, are the result of the dangerous right conceded to the Senate to invoke personal government whenever the privileges of their class are threatened or whenever they're invaded. Demagogues, he wrote, fawned upon the people of Rome, and the Republic's officials were venal and corrupt. Yeah. The Republic's decline, he continued, was due to the collapse of the moral values of its citizens and to their all-consuming desire to be rich. Well, okay. But then there's this, and this is a little longer, but this is the cherry on the icing. The Roman Republic, he wrote, possesses an interest, civil as well as military. Forewarned is forearmed. Free people, like the Romans, admire heroism and love to reward military achievement. No monarch in Europe has today the power of an American president. With the consent of the Senate, from the Chief Justice down, he has the gift of more than 90,000 civil offices, any one of which, save in the judiciary, he can vacate and fill at pleasure. Ever since the acceptance of the pernicious maxim, to the victim belongs the spoils, these offices, like so much gold, have been distributed by senators and representatives to the men who have been or may be the most loyal to themselves and the party. With the people thus accustomed to executive corruption, let us imagine, as under the Roman system, our president, in uniform, booted and spurred, galloping from the White House to the camp, his military retinue swelled by senators and representatives, fawning for favor and scrambling for spoils. How long, it would be asked, would our liberties survive? The historian from the example of Rome, he concluded, might not fix the exact duration of the Republic, but he could make at least one prophecy of speedy fulfillment. At the first meeting held at headquarters, the means would be discussed of prolonging the term of the president, if not the more startling proposition of declaring him president for life. Well, that passage, ladies and gentlemen, was written either in late 1878 or early 1879. The reason that jumped off the page was, in writing that chapter, I was getting into the political journals of the day and found out something I had never known. And that is, in 1878-79, there was a significant movement within the Republican Party to draft Ulysses S. Grant for a third term. Rutherford B. Hayes had been elected in 76, but his fraudulency, the crime of 76, there was a lot of unhappiness, there was a lot of corruption. And when you look at the political journals of the time, Ulysses S. Grant is being offered up as a savior. He's the man who can save the Republic. He's the man who can bring an end to all of this. Upton's writing about Grant here. Upton's writing about the guy who promoted him to brigadier general after Spotsylvania. Upton is writing about a republic collapsing with a general become president for life. Upton's reforms, and Don read one of my conclusions, in my mind, was his effort to save the Republic. Now, whether or not they would have accomplished that's another thing. But he's not trying to create a militaristic society. He's trying to save us from one. So that's one aspect of it. And then there's one other, and then I'll be done and take questions. It was a very common complaint that these national volunteers they proposed, that this was Prussian militarism. I'll be honest with you, I never understood that. it just simply went right by me. He was proposing an army of 150,000 men. The National Volunteers would make the army 150,000 strong if they were called into service. That's a small army. European armies in the day were 2 and 3 million men in the field. 150,000 men in a nation at that time of about 76,000, it's nothing. He's not proposing conscription. He's proposing volunteers. Volunteers had worked in the Mexican-American War. Volunteers had worked in the Civil War. They'd had their problems. Primarily, the problems of the Civil War were primarily, and the Mexican-American War, is that they weren't in long enough. The length of service wasn't long enough. But the volunteers had worked well. He's trying to take a system that he knew worked and make it better. After a regimental reunion in 1880, he wrote to one of his former officers, he said, "When I saw the veterans," meaning at the reunion, "I had a right to feel proud. They had fought as few men had ever fought before to save their country and liberty." And he knew what these guys could do. He'd seen what they could do. And then in 1878, he wrote to then Representative James A. Garfield, "Whatever military record I have was won as a volunteer. And like all of our people, I believe in the future we shall have to look to volunteers whenever great emergencies arise. Only let us give them good organization and call them out for a period sufficiently long to enable them to become heroes like those at Vicksburg, Atlanta, Gettysburg, and Richmond." So what I'm proposing here then in this book, and again, I was completely surprised by my conclusion that I came to, is that he is a misunderstood reformer. Don chose an interesting word when he introduced me, my defense of Upton. I guess that's what it is, but it didn't start out that way. It's not where this book was going when I started it. It ends up, I guess rather than defending, I like the word correcting. Correcting the record regarding who he was and what it was he was trying to do. Any questions? Thank you. Thank you. Sir.
Upton's suicide, I know that he was ailing and in physical pain, but was he also in low spirits? I mean, the military policy manuscript has not been published, and the Senate bill embodying his ideas had been defeated. Did he die considering himself a failure?
That's a tough question. If you just read the letters he wrote at the end of his life, you could come to that conclusion, and Ambrose and others did. I think you got to take a broader view of it. So for those of you unaware of the physical ailment, first of all, and here I have to give credit to a team of Army doctors who wrote an article in the Journal of Military Medicine where they went back through his medical records and backtracked and figured out what he was suffering from. And what he was suffering from, and it probably had started to grow when he was the commandant of cadets at West Point, so this was with him for roughly the last 10 years of his life, was he had some sort of benign tumor that was growing between his brain and his nasal cavity that today is eminently operable, but back then not even diagnosable, much less operable. And so he was in intense pain because of this. His eyesight was failing, he couldn't sleep. His handwriting, which was never any good, was absolutely miserable at the end of his life, and it's one of the symptoms of this disease. He was in so much pain that in the summer of 1880, when he was promoted to colonel, given command of the 4th Artillery Regiment, he was at Fortress Monroe. He delayed his assignment to San Francisco, as 4th Artillery was out at the Presidio. He delayed his assignment to San Francisco for months. and without trying to tell anybody what he was doing, why he was trying to delay it. He wanted to stay on the East Coast. Well, the reason he wanted to stay on the East Coast was he was seeing a doctor in Philadelphia, a nasal specialist. And this nasal specialist had diagnosed him as having a nasal, and I believe the correct pronunciation is catarrh, C-A-T-A-R-H, I think is the spelling. If you look it up in the dictionary, it's inflammation of the mucous membranes. The treatment was not pleasant. The treatment for this was to stick steel rods connected to electrodes that were red hot up into his nasal cavity to cauterize the membranes. That sounded like a good idea tells you how much pain he must have been in. And so then we get to the end of life, and my tactics are a failure. They're going to get men killed on the battlefield. He writes these things. I really think that mental collapse is due to physiological reasons. And the one other thing I will say, when the Burnside bill got defeated, Sherman had been concerned about the Burnside bill because he thought, and it's great insight, I mean, it's still true of politics in Washington today, that there was so much going on in the Burnside bill that these people will hate this part, and these people will hate this part, and these people will hate this part, and by the time you all get done with it, everybody hates it, rather than doing it piecemeal. We should be doing this one piece at a time. And so when the Burnside bill got defeated, Upton, he didn't throw down and quit. He said, all right, we're going to work on mandatory retirement. First thing, we got to have mandatory retirement. And he went to work. So he didn't throw down and quit because of the Burnside bill. He kept working on mandatory retirement. So I really do. I think his suicide was more about the physiology, that he was just in immense pain.
Just
couldn't take it. Right.
So,
Sir.
question on the research that you did and how you went about it. What was your primary source material? Were they letters, diaries, and was his handwriting really that bad?
Oh, his handwriting's terrible. Yeah, I mean, so in the library, or I'm sorry, in the museum, you can see one of his letters, which is actually one of the better ones. Yeah, his handwriting's terrible. I had to teach myself how to read it. It's a real trick. So the vast majority of the material are Upton's letters he wrote, and so here in Batavia, not so much at West Point. At West Point, I'm looking at the Academy's records, but here in Batavia, New York Public Library had a small collection of Upton letters. Lots of Upton letters at the Hagley, again where the DuPont papers are. A ton of Upton letters at the Library of Congress in various people's collections, the Garfield collection, the Sherman collection, James H. Wilson collection. They have lots of Upton letters there. A lot in the National Archives. I mean, there's a ton of stuff in the National. And for those, if you're wondering what the difference is between National Archives and Library of Congress, the National Archives is the government's file cabinet. It's where official documents go. The Library of Congress is, as its name implies, it is Congress's library, but they also have a manuscript division where people have donated their papers, and so you can go to the manuscript division and look at the Grant papers or look at the Sherman papers. And so that's what I was doing at the Library of Congress. So, I mean, there's just treasure troves of letters out there. One that I found that's the wrong noun-verb combination. One collection that was shown to me, Sal Solella, the author of the Regimental History of the 121st New York, contacted me and said, hey, did you know that there's about 60 letters from Upton to his wife here in the Princeton University Library? And I didn't know that. And he very generously sent me digital copies of every one of them. Well, that's the good news. The bad news is that his handwriting's miserable. The worst news is that he sent them to me. I was literally within a couple of weeks of being done revising my manuscript and sending it off to the publisher. And so I get these 60 letters, and this makes me a bad person, I guess. I'm praying to God there's nothing in them. I'm praying to God that this is pick up the milk before you come home, honey, kind of right. And the very first letter I look at, I don't have a copy of it here. So Upton did what a lot of folks did in the 8th or 19th century. So here's your 8 by 10 piece of paper. He'd fold it like this, and he'd write. And all of his letters are the same way. So up here is the date and where he is, and then my dearest Emily or dear Louisa or whoever, and then and you'd fill it, and then open the page and fill it and fill it and close it and fill it, and then if you went on to another piece of paper, he'd do the same thing. And so when you copy it, you then open it up, and so you're looking at page 1 and 4 and page 2 and 3. Okay? So the first one I look at is to Emily, and I'm reading it through, and it goes, I very much want to make love to you. Because this is not who he was, right? So there's that. But then it gets more interesting. So you get down to the bottom. I met with, and I don't recall his name, I met with General, and it took me a while to figure out the General's name, and we inspected the Corps, and I didn't recognize the General's name. And I was thinking, again, bad handwriting, so maybe I'm misreading it. I finally went to the Google. and I Googled the name. And the general was the commander of the French army at the time, in the middle of the 1870s. Okay. Did he ever come to the United States? Some are looking to see if he might have ever come to the United States. Where would Upton have run into him? What are they looking at? And man, I'm not seeing anything. There's no indication in what I can find out about this guy that he ever set foot in the United States. So I'm really scratching my head. And then I do what I should have done at first. So I looked at the date on the letter. The date on the letter was during his honeymoon. They honeymooned in Europe. They went to southern France and Italy because of her ill health. They thought it would help. And this guy left his wife in some town, I never did figure out what the town was, left his wife in some town in southern France for a week or so he could go up and take a look at the French army. And then wrote his wife a letter. Right, yeah. And so, I mean, those two very different parts of him on the same side of that piece of paper. And that was the first letter that I saw, and I thought, oh, damn it, I've got to look at all these damn things, don't I? So I hired a former student, and she helped me, and we worked our way through those letters. And they were fascinating. And the letters were, so if you think about this, in a normal relationship, you don't write letters to your wife, right? Because you're with your wife. And so you're only going to write letters to your wife when you're not with your wife. She was constantly ill. They got married in February of '68. They stuck around the United States until summer. They honeymooned in Europe. They came back from Europe. The plan was that she was going to go back to Willowbrook over in Auburn, and that he was going to go to Memphis, which is where his duty station was, but her health wouldn't support it. And so instead, she went to Key West for the warm weather and spent part of the winter in Key West and another part of the winter in Nassau in the Bahamas. And these 60, with that exception, that one letter written during the honeymoon in France, the rest of those 60 letters are written during that time when he's in Memphis, briefly in Louisville, and she's in either Key West or Nassau. And it really gives you some insight into their relationship that I didn't have until I didn't find until those letters were pointed out to me.
When did she die again?
She died in March of 70.
70?
March of 70.
So they just had really almost 2 years.
Only 2 years. Yep. Yep.
David, I just want to say that I wrote her printer every day, a letter.
Actually, he wrote her letters, sometimes 2 letters a day, and because he's trying to figure out, so that wherever she is, he's got to get letters to either New Orleans, what were they, New Orleans? Maybe Wilmington, no, New Orleans, Baltimore, and New York, I think were the 3 ports. There were 3 ports that would ship the letters out, and so he would sometimes write 2 letters a day, one going to each one going to a different port, so that one of them might get there more quickly. And he was timing the letters. He was looking at the schedules of ships. He's trying to time the letters so that they'd get on the ship at the right time. And what's fascinating is, and also at once aggravating, is the damn letters were sometimes different. They were different. So as a historian, so how do you footnote that? Because the typical way is you go E. Upton to E. Martin Upton, date, and where the letter is, Princeton University Library. Well, crap, I got 2 letters with that date. So I figured out a way to do it, but yeah, it was kind of interesting.
So, 100 years from now, how are historians going to, what are they going to look at when they look back? We're not writing letters anymore.
Oh, that's a good question. Let me tell you, historians are already worried about this because so when I was in graduate school, the first serious history project I had was long before I looked it up and had to do a what's known as seminar papers, what we call it at Michigan, original research. You're looking at primary source material, that is letters and such. And it had to be something you could research in town. They were going to send you around the country to do it. Well, I got the Ford Presidential Library, is at the University of Michigan. So I went to the Ford Library, and I got myself a topic that looked interesting to me and started researching it. And I'm opening up these boxes, and I'm opening up these folders. And this was my first contact with history. I'm holding history in my hand. I remember the day clearly. I got a 5-page document from the National Security Advisor to the President of the United States. And the HK, Henry Kissinger, has initialed the national security portion of it, and GF has initialed the presidential end of it. And I'm looking at this document. Holy crap! This is history. So this is how we write history. With the advent of emails and all this, God knows. Because so the good news is the government somewhat quickly, when they realized there was this problem, laws got passed. You got to preserve all these things. You got to preserve. Well, not on paper. You got to preserve the electronic records. Here's the bad news. When they started doing this, they were still operating on the reel-to-reel machines, And so they got all this stuff on reel-to-reel stuff, nothing to read it with. And the magnetic tape, of course, eventually disintegrates. And so I don't know what the answer is.
And even talking about like donating papers, I mean, now everybody's papers are just on their computer.
Correct, yeah. Yeah, historians 50 years from now are going to have a difficult time. And government records might be the easy part of it, trying to figure out, because, I'm texting your wife, right? I mean, that's just going to be gone. And
Or even like floppy disks.
correct.
You wouldn't even be able to, it'd be very difficult to find a floppy disk reader now.
Yep, sure would be.
Yeah, and you were talking, your opening comment was about personality and character. And the essence of history for me isn't what's in those government whatevers, it's in the diaries and the journals and the letters that show the personality of the person.
I would tell you that it's all. I mean, I mean, the government there are a lot of government documents that are a part of this work. I mean, again, forgive me because I suspect I'm preaching to people who know this, but the OR, the official records of the War of Rebellion. I mean, I could not have done this, and for that matter, no historian of the Civil War could do their work without the OR. If you're not familiar with what the OR is, after the Civil War, the War Department set out to collect all of the paper records it could of the Civil War for both sides. Now, it was a bit more difficult for the Confederate side than for the Union, but for both sides, after-action reports, status reports, telegrams between officials, I mean, you name it. And they published the OR in the 1880s, and Don, help me here. How many volumes are there in the OR? 150, 180? Yeah. I mean, it's massive. It's massive. Most of the major campaigns of the Civil War have 3 volumes to it. 2 volumes for the Union side and 1 volume for the Confederate side. And there's a lot of Emory Upton in the OR because he wrote the after-action reports for the 121st New York, for the 2nd Brigade, 1st Division, 6th Corps. Those records are important. They really are.
But isn't it different what you're writing for your superiors or your whatever than what you're going to write in a journal or a diary or
Maybe.
private thoughts? I mean, Queen Victoria, for instance, has her entire 75-year, all the statements she made and everything that was official and everything that was everything. But it's reading her diaries.
Well, they're
Bring her alive.
well, they're certainly for a different audience, but it depends on the person too. So after-action reports are a good example, and this is true whether it's the Civil War or whether it's what's going on in Afghanistan. Some people, when they write after-action reports, it's everything my unit did was great. We didn't screw anything up, and the bad guys lost, and we won, and everything's hunky-dory. And then there's a lot of after-action reports that are, yeah, we had this problem and that problem. This didn't work out very well. The next time we do this, we need to be thinking about this, which is, of course, what after-action reports are supposed to be. So I would submit to you, even there, it tells you something about the person who's writing the after-action report. That if you're getting the latter, you've got one thing, and if you're getting the former, you've gotten another. Yes, ma'am.
Do you feel a closeness being here from where you came?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Have you visited the family home?
I've not been to the family home. I'm sorry to say. Yeah. I'll have to check it out. It was in this room where I did my research. When was I here first? Summer of '93. This was the room.
Having graduated from West Point, do you feel that Emory Upton, being 17 years old, being there for 5 years, is what set him on the course of his thinking and doing anything about him?
I think he was on that course before he got to West Point. Oh yeah, he applied for admission to West Point. So he got in. Let me do the math here. He got in 56. He applied for admission in 55. He was not yet 16 years old when he sent his letter to Congressman Pringle, who represented the area here. And to explain how West Point admissions worked then as opposed to today, each member of Congress had one appointment, and that's it. And I don't believe West Point had any say in that appointment. So Congressman Upton, Fred Upton is the congressman from West Michigan, by the way. Congressman Upton appoints Dave Fitzpatrick to go to West Point. I'm his appointment until I quit, I'm thrown out, I die, or I graduate. And the minute one of those happens, he can appoint someone else. And then what happened in the 1850s, and for much of West Point's early career, is the cadets all showed up, and then they were examined. They took rigorous academic examinations, rigorous physical examinations, rigorous physicals, and a bunch of them were thrown out there. You're done. So Upton applied to Pringle in 55. He wasn't yet 16 years old. And Pringle said, no, you got to get more education. So his father sent him to Oberlin. And the book gets into the details about it's kind of a weird setup. The two older sons had gone to Oberlin. Daniel had bought them what amounted to a scholarship. And they used their scholarship, but the scholarship was still there. And so Upton took advantage of one of those scholarships and went to Oberlin, but not to the college side. Went to what amounted to a prep school for a year, and then applied back again in 1856. And I don't know what the circumstance was that Pringle had a slot in 55 and 56, but he did. And so that's every indication I've seen. In fact, while he was at Oberlin, as you might imagine, all these abolitionist speakers are coming through town. Charles Grandison Finney, the Tappan brothers, Calvin Stowe, Harry Beecher Stowe's husband, comes through. There are great rallies on the campus when this is going on. And Upton wouldn't go to these things. And his roommate asked him, well, why aren't you going? And this is not an exact quote because I don't have it in front of me, but it's close. He says, let those fellows, meaning the people out of the rallies, let those fellows do their studies, and by they might do this country some good. In other words, they're wasting their time at these damn rallies raising hell. There's work to be done here, and I'm here to do that work. And that's while he was at Oberlin. And it's after that he wrote that letter that I read at the opening here. Yeah, this kid's on a mission long before he got... West Point's part of the mission. West Point doesn't put him on the mission. It's part of the mission.
I think at West Point, about 1861, didn't you get in fights with the Southern group?
Yeah, it's one of the famous stories at West Point. And so to understand what happened here, I was just, in a different context, I was describing to Don tonight how the cadet barracks used to be laid out. And there's a small number of barracks that are still laid out this way, but most of the barracks, what the rest of the world calls dorms, they're dorms. Yeah? You got a floor and you got dozens of rooms on the floor. But the older barracks, and they were all this way when Upton was a cadet, are what are known as divisions. So you got a building, but you got a series of doors in the building, and you go in this door, and there's 4 rooms on the floor. Upstairs, 4 rooms on the floor. Upstairs, 4 rooms. Upstairs, 4 rooms. There's a division right next door to you. If you want to get to that division, you got to go all the way down, go over, and go up. I spent the last 2 years I spent as a cadet. I was in the Old South barracks, and we had divisions, and they're still there. So the story goes that the Southern cadet Wade Hampton Gibbs had insulted Upton, and what the insult was is not entirely clear. There's some speculation that he had charged Upton with sleeping with black women while he was at Oberlin. Oberlin was, of course, a co-ed and co-racial institution at the time. Whatever it was, they decided to have a duel, and they went into one of these divisions, and and these divisions are fire traps. There's only one door into the division, and they went into the first floor of the division and had a saber duel. And cadets blocked the way into the door into the division so that the officers of the guard couldn't get in and break it up. Sir?
You know, you mentioned Stephen Ambrose. Of course, later he was in trouble for plagiarism and acts of academic dishonesty, claiming he conducted interviews that he didn't really. Did you find evidence that he had done anything of the sort in his Upton book? And what is your frank, unvarnished opinion of Ambrose's book?
Well, I'll tell you what. I mean, what I'm going to tell you, you can find in the footnotes. So it's not like I'm unwilling to tell it. So, my frank, unvarnished opinion is it's not a very good book. I found all sorts of problems with his research. Things he should have seen that he didn't. Again, a good example being the reports that he wrote, and this is how I know he was down in at the Serbo-Turkish War, is he wrote an extended report that he sent back to the Secretary of War. So it's in the National Archives of what they saw down in the Serbo-Turkish War. There are all sorts of problems, but here's the one that just kind of sticks out in my mind. It tells us a lot. And this is his dissertation. It turns out it's his second book. He'd already published a book before he published his dissertation, so it's his second book. It's emblematic of the problem he had apparently throughout his career. Upton had a bright Iowa farm boy as his orderly when he was commanding the cavalry division out west. The kid's name was E.N. Gilpin, and Gilpin kept a wonderful diary, just an amazing diary of the events before going on Wilson's raid, on that cavalry raid, and then of the raid. It's just a marvelous source. It sits in the Library of Congress. In the early 1900s, Gilpin wrote an article for the Cavalry Journal that he claimed was his diary from the cavalry raid. It was not. There was all sorts of stuff in that article that wasn't in the diary, and clearly a lot of it was made up.
This is Ambrose.
Well, this is Gilpin. So I'm talking about the two sources. So there's the Gilpin diary, which is a beautiful thing, and then there's this article that Gilpin wrote in the early 1900s, which you can see the diary in it. I mean, there's elements of the diary in it to be certain, but he's
In other words, memory just got enhanced.
yeah, it's not memory enhancement. He's making it up, and
Sorry.
how rude! That would never happen to me.
Where it is. I'm sorry.
That's
Go on. Keep listening, though. I wear hearing aids and it rings in my ear.
Well, there-
I didn't know it was ringing.
there. You go. It stopped. So, well, let me. So, you got the Gilpin diary, which is this great document. You've got the Gilpin article, which is a piece of junk. Ambrose, in his dissertation and in the book, cites the diary. But the stuff that he's citing isn't in the diary. It's in the article. It's in the article. And the and the crazy thing is that, again, the diary is so rich with stuff that should be in his book. But the conclusion I drew was that he and it may be an unfair conclusion, is that he saw the Cavalry Journal article, which was I'm sure on microfilm. That's how I saw it. Didn't need to go anyplace to see it. Could go to the University of Wisconsin Library, which is where he did his PhD work, and read that article. And he just assumed it was the diary and never bothered going to the Library of Congress and actually looking at the real thing. And the real thing is just it's gold. It's just pure gold. So yeah, it's really unfortunate the things he did, because he was a talented guy, and he got lazy and sloppy from the very get-go.
Well, we have a monument for Emory Upton, not exactly him, but it's here right in the table. But also we have a uniform that Emory wore. What physical size was Emory? I looked at uniform.
He was small,
Yeah.
like 5.
How would you get into there?
5 foot. He was 5'5" and maybe 120 pounds soaking wet.
That's how I got it.
Yeah. Well, realize, I mean, we're bigger today too. I mean, my grandmother's brother, my grandmother, my father's mother, her brother was West Point class of January 43. He was supposed to be June of 43, but they sped him up 6 months for the war. January 43, and joined the Army Air Corps and flew B-17s over Germany in the Second World War. Got in something like 35 missions before the war was over. And then stayed in the Air Force for a career. And I remember, and there's a point to this. I remember meeting Uncle Jim first time when I was maybe 4 or 5 years old. And he was home in Kalamazoo, Michigan, wearing his blue Air Force uniform. And I'm looking up at him, oh man, this guy's 6 feet tall and Air Force, and he was impressive. He was really impressive. Well, there's no way you're 6 foot tall and you fit inside a B-17 cockpit. Jim was probably about 5'6", and probably didn't weigh a hell of a lot more than Emory Upton did. But I remember as a kid thinking, my God, this is this big guy, yeah. Sir.
Military ideas have any relevance, like at West Point or in today's world?
Well, I mean, his ideas were primarily organizational. So unlike, sometimes there are people who will draw the false comparison. I think it's a false comparison between him and Alfred Thayer Mahan. Alfred Thayer Mahan was roughly a contemporary United States Navy, and he was laying out an argument for having a Navy and for what that Navy ought to consist of and what its missions ought to be. And trust me when I tell you, if you've never heard of Alfred Thayer Mahan, trust me when I tell you that the United States Navy today worships at the altar of Alfred Thayer Mahan. I mean, Mahan still is a god to them. Upton wasn't Mahan. Upton wasn't telling people how to use the Army. That he was focused on organizational changes. And so if you want to look at Uptonian changes, that we have a war college, that we have a staff college, that we have promotion by merit, that lineal promotion is gone, that there's mandatory retirement, these among other things, that there's the reorganization of the Army staff that happened in the early 1900s. These are all Uptonian in their. Oh no, nothing that he proposed happened before he committed suicide.
This is more about you personally. What was your mindset going into West Point just on the heels of the Vietnam War?
I'm gonna sound like a money grubber here, aren't I? Let me change your question just a little bit. Why did I go to West Point? How about that? My family's got a minor tradition there. Again, my grandmother's brother went there. My dad's brother was a West Point graduate, fought in Vietnam. So there's a minor family tradition, but we're talking early 1970s. The student loan programs and grants weren't what they are today. They weren't terribly robust. I came from a lower middle class family, I would guess you would call it. I mean, we were comfortable, but we weren't rich. And I remember really well, my dad says, so, John, my family knows me as John. He says, John, where do you want to go to school? I want to go to the University of Michigan. I want to go to Michigan State. He goes, oh, who's going to pay for it? You're not? No. He goes, you ought to look at West Point. Okay. And I will tell you that I think for a lot of my classmates, that was the motivation, was that it's a good college education, and it's more than free. It's you get paid to go there. I knew what I was getting into. I guess Vietnam didn't really enter into my thought process at all, because by the time I got there, we were out of Vietnam. The war wasn't over yet. South Vietnam collapsed spring of my freshman year, spring of my plebe year. But yeah, it didn't really enter into my thought process at all. But it was, yeah, Dad ain't paying for this. Well, I'm happy to stick around and answer questions or do it, but thank you very much. Thank you.